Hi, everybody. So I'll just start off by introducing myself. I'm Dr. Rachel Hussey, and I'm a consultant clinical psychologist working in NELF, who are the provider of children's mental health services across Kent and Medway.
And I'll introduce myself. I'm Dr. Virginia Lumsden, a consultant clinical psychologist, and I'm the clinical and strategic lead for the emotional wellbeing teams in Kent and the emotional support teams in Medway. Could we have the next slide, please, Lorraine? Okay, so thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Just an outline of what we're going to cover. We're going to start with a very brief overview of post-pandemic children and young people's mental health trends. And then Rachel is going to talk in detail, providing an introduction to functional neurological symptoms, which is the main focus of our discussion this afternoon. We will have an activity for everybody to do, and we will have a short break, and we'll also then think about how education settings can support children and young people with functional neurological symptoms or suspected functional neurological symptoms, and there'll be a breakout room where there'll be time to kind of reflect and talk about what you've heard, and then we'll come back together for kind of whole group questions and reflections. Next slide, please. So children and young people's mental health in a post-pandemic world. This is a very brief overview. If we could have the next slide, please. I don't know how familiar people will be with this statistic, but I imagine most people will be quite familiar with this statistic, which is it's now estimated that 1 in 6 children in England have a probable mental health disorder, and that's data from NHS Digital in 2021. So that's the most up-to-date estimate that we have. That's the same as it was in 2020, but it's an increase from 1 in 9 in 2017. It's quite a concerning figure. It's certainly concerning for us working in children and young people's mental health services, and I'm sure it's something that for those of you working in education settings is equally concerning. Some of the other headlines from that report, there's a link to the report at the end if people want to read it, but some of the other headlines are that girls and young women are more likely to have experienced a decline in their mental health in recent years. We've seen an increase in eating problems, and we've seen a really high prevalence of sleep difficulties. Someone said that they're unable to hear. I don't know whether that's are other people able to hear me? Yeah, okay, thank you. So a really high prevalence of sleep difficulties. So that's things like waking up early and not being able to get back to sleep. That's difficulty getting to sleep at night, and it's also waking in the night on 3 or more nights a week. And we know that that prevalence of sleep difficulties is particularly high amongst children and young people with a diagnosable mental health problem. The kind of cause and effect isn't completely understood. So we know that if you have a mental health difficulty, you might find sleep more difficult, but we also know that if you're not sleeping well, that can impact negatively on your mental health. So those are some headlines from that report, which gives us a sense of our kind of current context. The next slide, please, Lorraine. I think this is a helpful model when we're thinking about that headline and when we're trying to understand the increase that we've seen in recent years. So kind of how and why problems with mental health come about for children and young people, but also to help us to think about what we can do to help. So this model, people might be familiar with it, has the child at the centre and the child and their kind of individual characteristics. And then around the child are all the different parts of the child's world, the system around the child that influence a child's experience of life, influence their well-being, influence their mental health. So their family context, for example, their experience of school, friendship groups, religious groups, and then kind of moving out Obviously, we could place the pandemic and a kind of life post-pandemic within this model. We can also think about things like the cost of living crisis and how that might impact. So each of these layers can impact positively and negatively, but what I think it really helpfully does is point to how many different influences there are on children and young people's mental health, and points to where we might be able to find resources that would help and where we might find things that might be contributing towards a problem. It also really highlights the importance of all of us who work with children and young people, working together to try and support children and young people. And that kind of links to kind of why we're here today, and why we've started this initiative where we'll be meeting with education staff to talk about some of the things that are really current and prevalent in children and young people's mental health at the moment, with a view to us working really effectively together. So I'm going to hand over to Rachel, who's going to talk in detail about functional neurological symptoms specifically, which is one area where this kind of idea of working together and thinking about all of those parts of the system is really important.
Hi, everybody. So what I want to do is just give you a kind of understanding of functional neurological symptoms, because we have experienced a significant increase in the numbers of young people coming through to our service and the number of young people that we're hearing about in schools who are presenting with functional neurological symptoms. So we thought it would be helpful to start off this kind of first kind of opportunity for us to provide some training to education colleagues with this particular area, because it's something that is very kind of key in the post-pandemic world, and something that possibly people may not have come across prior to that. Next slide, please. So the kind of key things to understand is that we're talking about young people who are presenting with physical symptoms that don't have an obvious medical cause, and this is what's known as functional symptoms. So they may be presenting with, say, for example, seizures. They may, for example, be presenting with tics, but actually we don't think there's an organic cause for this. The important thing to understand is that these symptoms are real, and that, you know, the way that our kind of brain and body work together can sometimes get there can be cross wires in that, because the brain and body are constantly sending messages to each other and are very closely linked. And this is kind of what's happening. I'll go into this a bit more detail whereby the body is kind of misunderstanding some of the signals that are coming from the brain. So next slide, please. These, functional neurological symptoms have been around forever. We have seen a definite increase post-pandemic, but they've kind of used to be called kind of many years ago. You see this picture of this lady fainting here, and in this time in the 19th century, it would have been called hysteria. But over the years, we've kind of heard phrases such as psychogenic, conversion disorder, non-organic symptoms. Medically unexplained symptoms is a commonly used term. Functional symptoms, as I'm discussing now, and in that family of functional symptoms, we have things like non-epileptic attack disorder, non-epileptic seizures, or dissociative seizures. They're all talking about the same thing. Okay, next slide, please. So I've got a little video now, which I'm just going to ask to be played, just talking a little bit about functional neurological disorders.
Lorraine, there's no sound, you need to share sound. There's no sound for Zoom, so you need to go, if you share your screen, and there should be an icon that says when you reshare it on the Zoom for share sound on the bottom right.
What are functional neurological disorders? Think of your brain like a computer. In this computer there is hardware or cable work, and there is software. The brain software controls how your brain communicates with itself, with the outside world, and also the body. Functional neurological disorders, or FND, are like glitches of the software part of the brain. This can cause a variety of symptoms. Common problems in patients with FND are episodes of altered or loss of consciousness, which are called dissociative attacks. They can look like epileptic seizures, but are not due to abnormal electrical activity in the brain. Functional movement disorders can cause difficulty with walking, tremors, so uncontrollable shaking or weakness, and sometimes even whole body paralysis. There are other types of functional symptoms, including dizziness, sensory problems, speech disturbances, and cognitive symptoms. Literally every function that is controlled by the brain can be affected. It can even cause problems with bladder and bowel function. Functional neurological disorders are genuine disorders that cause real symptoms. The good news is that these disorders are treatable and many patients can improve. What are
Thanks very much. So just thinking about how common this is. So pre-pandemic, we had estimates that 1 in 10 children present with physical symptoms for which there's no underlying physical cause. So many of us will be familiar with this, you know, a child who's maybe got a test the following day might have tummy aches or be complaining about having headaches. But they can be also things like kind of dizziness and blurred vision, you know, sore muscles, weakness or tiredness. And we don't generally have to call that a kind of a disorder. That's typical, what we'd call somatization. That's typical way that kind of anxiety or a kind of psychological or emotion is then converted into something that we feel physically. I know that when I get kind of particularly tired or quite stressed, I start getting backaches. You know, that's how my body manifests stress. And so we all have that, and it doesn't need to be called a disorder, and it's very common. But there is a point at which we'll be saying that it is tipping into something which is more concerning. So, you know, some people will be more likely to have kind of physical symptoms as a result of stress. We also know it's somewhat cultural as well. In some cultures, talking about feelings is kind of less acceptable, and so you see probably that people will be going to the doctors more talking about headaches and stomach aches rather than be able to kind of discuss the underlying cause, which might be something a bit more psychologically motivated. So what we have seen is a significant increase in functional presentations post the pandemic. And we would be conceptualizing that that's probably as a result of kind of anxieties that have kind of risen up during the pandemic for children that haven't had the opportunity to be resolved in the way that they might have been if we'd all been out and about and going to school and living the normal life that we might have been leading. Okay, next slide, please. Just a quick slide about kind of prevalence. So this is, we tend to see kind of more of this presentation in females. And these are the kind of sorts of things that, you know, we would consider to be core symptoms. So motor weakness, abnormal movements, non-epileptic seizures, diminished consciousness, visual loss, limb paralysis, loss of speech or hearing loss. And some of those are kind of less common than others. Next slide, please. So what tends to happen is when people are presenting with some sort of kind of functional presentation, they may say, for example, it's unexplained seizures. They will go along to have some tests done in a health setting, and initially they'll be told you haven't had a stroke or you don't have epilepsy. Oh, okay, let's do an MRI or EEG because we really need to check this out. We maybe need to see another specialist. Oh, you're very complicated. Oh my goodness. Oh, your symptoms are very serious. And that leaves everyone feeling extremely stressed. At this point, we may have ruled out the fact that there is an organic cause for these symptoms, but it's really difficult for the family and young people, and indeed, you know, many of the people who may be surrounding that family, to accept that, because it seemed such a serious thing. And for quite a long period of time, there will have been lots and lots of tests being done, which will have been raising everybody's anxiety during that time. So one of the big things that we struggle with functional neurological symptoms is actually helping the family and the young person accept that the presentation that they have is not due to some neurological problem, that it's actually psychological in its basis. And that sometimes can be a huge stumbling block. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to do this training with you, because it's one of the areas where the whole system needs to come together in order for us to have a consistent approach, so that we're not reinforcing a message that symptoms are being caused by something neurological, and we are reinforcing the message that symptoms are being caused by something psychological. Next slide, please. So just thinking about the kind of difference, and one of the things that we try and do is kind of really emphasize what we call positive symptoms. So these are the symptoms that are that relate to a functional presentation rather than a neurological presentation. So I was just thinking about non-epileptic attack disorder. So this is kind of functional seizures, and it relates very much to a case that we might discuss a little bit, of a school that we've been doing some work with, where there were a group of young people who were presenting with non-epileptic attack disorder. So one of the things that's kind of key about kind of functional presentations is that they tend to be rather abrupt in their start, and they also start a little bit later than we would typically see the age of, so for example, epilepsy starting. The other thing would be that we would, you know, in some of the assessments that would be done for epilepsy, we would be able to see that there is some sort of abnormal electrical activity going on in the brain, but that won't be present for non-epileptic attack disorder. We very clearly use this as part of our intervention, using suggestibility and distraction, because we know that this can alleviate functional symptoms, but it does not alleviate neurological symptoms. We also know that functional symptoms are associated with stress and particular life events. But with neurological symptoms, while stress might have a little bit of an impact on it, they tend to wax and wane kind of at their own pace, not so related to kind of stress and life events. Eyes may be closed during a kind of functional seizure, where they may well be open during a neurological seizure. The functional seizures last much longer and often remit suddenly, whereas that would be very unlikely with a neurological epileptic presentation. Okay, next slide, please. So some good news, kind of thinking about functional seizures, they don't cause harm, physical harm, or if they do, it's quite minor. You might just have a bump, but there's not actually any damage being done to the brain. But we do need to really understand that these episodes are real and that this is not being done on purpose. What we try and do is we try and encourage, and we'll go into this in a little bit more detail, we try and encourage young people to have an external focus, not be focusing in on the symptoms that they're experiencing or the physical sensations of their body, but be trying to have an external focus, have their eyes open. Maybe when they're having a seizure, we tend to talk about using grounding techniques that help. We kind of try very hard to work with the system to ensure that life goes on as normal, that children who might be presenting with functional symptoms in school stay in school, don't get sent home, that ambulances aren't called, because what we want to do is we want to try and get their world back to normal as quickly as possible and not be reinforcing the message that this is a medical emergency. Next slide, please. And another video.
What causes functional neurological disorders, and can anyone get it? There are usually several factors that play a role in the development of functional neurological disorders, or FND. Biological, psychological, and social factors. Among these factors are some that make the brain vulnerable, some that trigger episodes, and some that prevent people from getting better. Physical injuries and pain can be a common trigger, for example. Anxiety and depression can make brains vulnerable towards FND, and traumatic life experiences can be another factor. It is important to know, though, that not everybody with FND has had trauma in the past, and you don't have to be anxious or depressed to develop FND. So yes, anyone can get FND. What causes
Sorry, could get off mute there for a second. Sometimes it gets a bit sticky, those buttons. So just kind of following on from the video, thinking about the kind of causes of this, it's really important to conceptualize that kind of functional neurological symptoms are not only located within a young person and stress that they might be experiencing. There is kind of quite a lot of literature that supports the idea that this is often related to what I would call systemic stress, so stress that's kind of within the system, and it really fits that we've seen this increase in this presentation during the pandemic. When we go back to thinking about the slide that Virginia talked about, looking at the child's world and the systems around the child's world, the systems around children change so dramatically during the pandemic. It's not surprising that we're seeing a presentation that particularly is affected by kind of external stressors, seeing an increase. So we have to kind of, when we're thinking about how to support young people, we have to think about how we kind of support them with the sorts of strategies that are going to be beneficial for them, but we have to also make sure that the systems around them are in place and working as well, because we know that without that, any intervention is unlikely to be effective. So as I've kind of said, this is the kind of brain's response to stress. And there's a little picture that you'll see here, which kind of has input going into all the senses, and then that going to the brain, and then that moving to kind of output. And how we are conceptualizing this is that the thing that's getting misconstrued is the kind of sensory experience of, say, for example, something like anxiety, and the brain is misinterpreting that and has created a kind of template when they experience that, when the brain experiences those different symptoms of anxiety, that the brain will respond in a particular way, and it may be any of those functional symptoms that have been described, be it a tremor, be it a tic, be it a seizure. We kind of have to think about it as almost like the brain becomes a bit overwhelmed and, excuse me, and goes into a kind of fight, flight, freeze and flop mode. But the most important thing to understand is that the response around the young person also can be one of the big maintaining factors in these symptoms. So whilst it's not necessarily the cause of functional neurological symptoms, we have to really work on the response of everybody around the child, because that can be the thing that really maintains it. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about interoception. So sometimes this is called the sixth sense, and it is the ability for us to have to be able to sense what's going on inside our bodies. So kind of across all our organs within our body, there are little cells that are sending messages out to the brain all the time, giving us feedback about what's going on. And this, this information can kind of give you the sense of an understanding about the fact that maybe your heart is going a little bit faster than it normally goes, or your breathing is more shallow or is faster. And this ability, this kind of interoception ability, maybe calling it the kind of sixth sense, is something that some people are better at than others. So it should be happening automatically, and it is a way that we manage to kind of regulate ourselves and kind of have a sense of, our body temperature, how fast our heart is beating, how our breathing is working. That sort of kind of sense feedback to the brain. But we have a kind of a hypothesis that possibly interoception and kind of there being a mismatch in the messages that are kind of going to the brain, or how the brain is receiving them and understanding them, may be something that is part and parcel of the kind of reasons why some people will be developing functional neurological symptoms rather than others. Next slide, please. So thinking about maintenance, I have talked about the response to symptoms. That is one of the really key things that keeps FNS going. So if the response is continuously exploring new medical reasons for why a young person has got these symptoms, and reinforcing a message that it may be medical, and a very kind of heightened response with kind of heightened emotions, then it's quite likely that that's going to keep functional neurological symptoms going. But there are also other things that we're kind of aware of that keep it going as well. So as I kind of talked about a little bit earlier on, we try and encourage young people to not focus on the symptoms that they're experiencing, the internal sensation of their body when they are experiencing functional symptoms. We try and get them to focus on the external world. So in particular, maybe to have their eyes open, to be looking around them, using grounding techniques, because it's that focus on the internal symptoms that's likely to be kind of heightening anxiety even more, which is then likely to keep any functional episode going for longer. We also kind of talk about trying to work on safety behaviours, because if a young person is presenting with kind of FNS, it may be that they start reducing the level of engagement they have in normal activities, and they may start avoiding particular things because they think that those settings might be potential triggers for FNS. But actually what we know is that avoiding those sorts of things and reducing their world actually keeps FNS going for longer. The more we can get their world back to normal, the more likely they are to start moving into a recovery mode. And the other area that we work on is just this kind of sense of beliefs. So kind of misinterpreting physical symptoms, thinking that there is something seriously wrong in your body will be likely to keep FNS going. And so kind of working on those beliefs, really helping young people to understand that this is a psychological response, also kind of is helpful in terms of moving forward to a kind of a good prognosis, moving forward to no longer, experiencing symptoms. Next slide, please. So just here, this is just another slide kind of talking about how there is this overlap between what young people are attending to and their beliefs and expectations. So if they're attending very much to their body, noticing any change in their body, looking to see if a functional symptom's about to happen, or really focusing on it while it's happening. And if their beliefs and expectations are that this is a very serious seizure that they're having, and that maybe, say for example, it's epilepsy, then they are much more likely to kind of have a continuation of functional neurological symptoms. Okay, next slide, please. So what we do is, when we're working with young people, is we try and kind of break down all the kind of complexity of the very kind of unpleasant experience that they're likely to be having, and the kind of concerns and worries that they might be experiencing about what's going on for them, into different components. We call this creating a formulation. And by breaking it down into different components, it really helps to allow the young people to begin to understand what is happening to them and why it's happening and what is keeping it going. So what we do is we help them to just start understanding, say for example, in a particular situation, what they were thinking, and then how that might have impacted on what they do, their behavior, what they're experiencing in their bodies, and what emotions they're experiencing at that time. And by breaking it down into those different realms, we can start to think about, first of all, what we can do to help them, but we also give them a narrative whereby they can start understanding what is happening for them. Next slide, please. So we've done some work with some young people who are experiencing non-epileptic attack disorders in a school in Kent. And we kind of worked on a hypothetical situation of a kind of invented young person who we called Katie, who was having to move from being at break to return to a science class. So this Katie has been having non-epileptic attack seizures, and we got the young people to think through what might be happening in all these different boxes within this formulation. It's difficult to read, so I've kind of written some of them down. So I'm going to read out some of these thoughts that the young people came up with that they thought might be the sorts of things that Katie would be thinking about. So one was, I don't like the new layout. Another was, I'm different. I don't want another episode in front of people. People will judge. I might hurt myself. I don't want people to fuss. People are nice and aren't always nice and don't believe me. People will talk about me, make up stuff. People will leave me and I feel alone. So then we got the young people to say, what sorts of, if you're having those sorts of thoughts, what's it likely that Katie's going to do? What will be her behaviour? And they came up with that Katie's likely to stop talking, go quiet, zone out, push people away, lash out, and also quite likely to start kind of focusing on her body to notice whether or not, start scanning her body to notice whether or not she's feeling any of those symptoms that she's previously experienced. So really, and her senses are kind of likely to heighten as a consequence of that. And then we kind of wondered, what would Katie be experiencing in her body? And thought it's likely to be kind of sweating, increased racing heart rate, beating, stomach ache, feeling sick, shaking, headache, and maybe zoning out. And then the kind of related emotions to that would be being frustrated, being nervous, feeling annoyed. They particularly referenced a sense of dread, that's probably what Katie would be experiencing. She's moving from break into science. And then we kind of looked at it as a kind of whole, and you can see that all these things are interrelated. So it goes, you know, if Katie's having those thoughts and then engaging in those behaviors, feeling those bodily sensations and experiencing those emotions, it's then going to kind of spiral upwards, this scenario, whereby she's, you know, likely then to have even more catastrophic thoughts. And it may well be that she really does then zone out and start experiencing the sort of kind of bodily sensations that of shaking, headaches, feeling sick, which may then trigger her brain to kind of kick off the template that it's got. Oh, here we are. I'm experiencing those sensations again. This is going to be a seizure. So just this kind of understanding is helpful, because what we want the young people to do is to have some sense of why this is happening to them and understand that it's a psychological phenomena, and then have some faith in using some of the strategies that we then recommend to them. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to do an experiment with everybody now. And what I'm gonna ask everybody to do, and I know everyone's got their cameras off, so I'm asking you to kind of go with this, and please don't be doing emails during the time that we're doing this, because otherwise you don't get the opportunity to have kind of benefit from the learning that doing something like this will give you. I'm going to ask you to hold your hands out in front of you with your palms down for 1 minute. So holding your hands out like that in front of you for 1 minute. So if everyone could get their hands out in front of them now, please. And what I would like you to do is really focus on the feelings in your hand, okay? So I'm going to start the timer now. I want you to really focus on what your hands are feeling like, what your fingers are feeling like. Off we go. Okay. So does anyone feel able to talk about what sensations they noticed in their hands? Gemma.
Like, it was really odd because at first I didn't really feel like I could feel anything, if I'm honest, and then it was almost like I could feel a slight tingle, but then towards the end one of my fingers kept sort of jerking slightly where I was focusing on it, which was strange.
Did anyone else experience that?
My hands just felt as though they were swelling up and getting heavier and heavier, and they also felt very cold.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire. Thank you, Gemma. Okay. Okay, next slide, please. So the aim of that kind of experiment is just to really kind of help you get that sense of when you are focusing on something, you might have slightly different experiences to when you're not focusing on it. And it's all about perception. So this slide is just a kind of fun slide. And I just wondered if anyone can tell me what they can see.
It's Angela. I can see a vase and two faces.
So Angela, can you see the vase and the two faces at the same time?
No, I have to refocus.
Yeah. So you kind of have to flick, don't you? You can't actually see them all at the same time. So it's just an interesting one. And it kind of talks about how when you focus on something, you can't always see something else. So you have to kind of, if you're kind of focusing and your expectation is that you're going to see a vase, you will see a vase. But if your focus and your expectation is that you're going to see two people, you will see two people. And it's quite difficult to see them both at the same time. So much about what we see is about what we're expecting to see. And I think that's kind of a really critical thing to kind of understand in terms of being able to begin to conceptualize how it is that young people start experiencing functional neurological symptoms, because it's part of their expectation and their focus is on that and their brain is expecting that. So therefore their brain delivers it to them. Next slide, please. So now we're going to go to a break, which I think we've agreed is going to be
5 minutes.
5 minutes, yeah. And then everyone can come back in 5 minutes time. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So I just wanted I hope everyone managed to get up off their chairs and move around and do something else. I just kind of wondered if anybody felt able to, maybe kind of Claire and Gemma might kind of talk again about what their hands feel like now. Any thoughts on that?
As in, right this moment, Rachel, how do my hands feel?
Yep.
I haven't thought about it. They feel completely all right.
Thank you. Now. Thank you, Gemma. Can I just say that wasn't set up?
No, it wasn't.
So, sorry, I haven't put my camera back on. It's just that kind of key kind of message that when you do focus on something, you know, Gemma actually said that she began to notice, because she was focusing on it, at some point her finger actually started moving, you know, which is, you know, the sorts of kind of symptoms that we're talking about, that the brain actually starts focusing on that bit of the body, and then it starts making funny little things happen, like it starts jerking. And but when you haven't been thinking or focusing on your hand, it feels completely normal. So I'm now going to hand you over to Virginia, who's going to talk a little bit about how this might be useful within an education setting.
Thank you, Rachel. Just before I go on to talk about that, I was just reflecting as you were talking, Rachel. I think it's really difficult to get your head around these kinds of symptoms when you know, they're not something that you've experienced yourself. And I know you and I have done a little bit of work with young people experiencing these, so I've perhaps got a bit more understanding. And I've had a bit of time to try and think about how I can relate to it. And I think one example that I find quite helpful is blushing, and thinking about, you know, these symptoms are kind of, they're involuntary symptoms. So although they have this psychological cause, they are completely involuntary. Something like blushing is quite a good example, because it can happen to us and it is involuntary, but the more you kind of think about it, perhaps the more likely it is to happen in the moment. Or if you're really conscious of not wanting it to happen, it can maybe make it more likely. And then when it does happen and you become aware of it, you know, I think that's yeah, for me, that's a kind of helpful way into understanding a little bit about these functional symptoms. The other one is, for me, is the physical. You were saying about your back, Rachel. The other one for me is like the physical association. Where I'm sort of fearful of heights, and I get a really strong feeling up the back of my legs, which is completely involuntary, but is, you know, is a really strong physical sensation, even though in my mind I can kind of know that I'm safe, etc.
Absolutely. I mean, I have one which is similar, because I don't like heights either, and it literally feels like electricity is coursing through my arms when I kind of realise. So it's a very strong physical sensation. Yeah.
So I think even though, you know, the things that people might have heard of, spoken about today, they might not be able to relate sort of directly to some of those. You'll probably, you know, as you kind of go away this evening and kind of mull it over, you'll probably come to think of some things for yourself that you kind of think, yeah, I kind of get what it might be like. Yeah, so thinking about education settings and how education settings can support children and young people with functional neurological symptoms. This relates really to the model that we showed you right at the beginning, and how those different parts of the system interact. And then what Rachel's spoken about the importance of the response of people around the child or the young person, and how that can influence the symptoms. And these best practice guidelines, which I'm going to talk about quite briefly, have been developed through some work that we've done with a school in Kent. So these have been developed kind of through the need to kind of learn how do we approach this best in schools. So they've been developed in collaboration with the school and with the children and young people and parents and carers. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. So I suppose first and foremost, what do you do if you're listening to this and you suspect that there might be a child or a young person experiencing functional neurological symptoms? So the first thing to do would be to advise a referral to the GP. to start the process of ruling in or out an underlying medical cause. And as Rachel said, you know, that process can be really stressful, and that process can in some ways kind of maintain the problem, but it is also really important to make sure that the response is appropriate to what we know is causing the difficulty. It might then be appropriate to discuss next steps with the single point of access, and then based on responses from both of those routes or one of those routes would be to develop a school management plan. There is additional support available. So, for example, if you do have an emotional wellbeing team in your school, then it's something that the emotional wellbeing team would be able to support with. The educational psychology service have also supported in some instances, and there are national resources out there as well. So those videos that we showed you, that's the link to the website that those videos came from, and there's lots of really useful information on that website as well. Next slide, please. So during the process of this work that Rachel and I have done in the school, we've worked with the educational psychology service to put together a draft management plan for schools, and that will be available from mid-October and will be you'll be able to download that from Kelsey. So the idea of that is that it's a draft management plan that you can then amend and kind of change and edit to suit the particular needs of your education setting, but it kind of contains all the key components so that you can be confident that you've not missed anything, and so that you can be confident that the response is supported by children and young people's mental health services. But the first point about the plan is that it is only suitable for students who've been identified as having functional neurological symptoms through the confirmation of the absence of any underlying medical cause. So that, you know, when Rachel was talking about, for example, non-epileptic attack disorder or the seizures, obviously it's really important to know that there isn't an underlying medical cause, because the response would be different. But once that has been confirmed, it then does give confidence that the response that you put together is an appropriate response. So where appropriate, schools might decide to establish an FNS management team within the school. And then that ensures that there's a swift response, there's a consistency in approach, that there's containment of the situation and the resulting anxiety, as well as minimising any contagion, which we haven't yet talked about, but could do, and make sure that there's joined up thinking. The next slide, please. Individual management plans can be really helpful, and again created at the earliest opportunity. So as Rachel's spoken about, the response of everybody around the young person is really important, and getting that response right as early as possible will really help with the prognosis. So creating that with staff, with the young person, and with parents and carers, and with an emphasis on young person themselves views. And the aim of that is to support the child to be able to participate as fully in school life as possible. So as we've already said, it's really important to try not to avoid situations that might lead to FNS, but to support the child to participate as fully as possible, to return to kind of normal life. And that effective partnership working with parents and carers is really key, so that everybody's on board. The next slide, please. So this is an example of what an individual management plan might look like. This is one that was specifically developed for non-epileptic attack disorder, and the young person can create this themselves. It can be helpful to think about the cross-sectional formulation, so that hot cross bun model that Rachel showed you earlier, that can help to inform this process. But thinking about what sort of things make an episode more likely, and then thinking about what helps. So what can the young person themselves do, and what might they like other people around them to do? So before an episode, during an episode, and after an episode. The next slide, please. We know from our experience of working with this that it's really important that education staff feel well supported. Functional neurological symptoms, depending on what kind of symptoms they are, they can be really distressing and anxiety provoking to witness. And that's a completely normal response. It can leave people feeling frightened, it can leave people feeling shocked, it can leave people feeling quite helpless. It can also leave people feeling frustrated, particularly, that kind of trying to understand that, it's an involuntary response, but there isn't an underlying physical cause, can be a really difficult thing to get your head around. So all kinds of emotions are understandable responses. And therefore, it's really important that there is psychoeducation for staff and staff support. And, depending again on the types of symptoms, the management of students with FNS can place a lot of additional pressure on school staff. So the next slide, please. So in the work that we did with some young people in a school who were experiencing functional neurological symptoms, we have their permission to share these messages from them when they were asked, what would you like people around you to know? And these are some of the things that they said. So treat me like a normal person, don't panic, try everything to enable me to stay in lessons, make me laugh, don't isolate or exclude me, treat me as an individual, for me to have a close connection with a teacher. If we miss lessons, help us to stay in the flow of the class and not miss out. And I think something that came across really strongly, and Rachel, I don't know whether you would agree with this, was just that sense from the young people that we were working with of how much they wanted to be part of lessons and they wanted to be part of school life, and how difficult it was for them to miss out. I think the other thing that really came across was how, even though these young people were experiencing the same functional neurological disorder, kind of on paper, the name of it was the same, it was a very different experience for each young person. So Rachel was talking about things like symptoms might include things like having a heightened sensory experience, so suddenly having a really sensitive sense of smell, for example. That might be one person's experience of it, but for someone else it might be that they can't hear anything. So it really, really varied amongst different young people, and I think that was something that was really important to young people, was that their individuality and their own personal experience wasn't lost as part of that. Next slide, please. So this is just a sort of hopeful slide. The piece of work that we did, I think we would say, was a relative success, in that young people's symptoms did reduce over the period of time. That was partly down to the psychoeducation and the work that was done, but it was also partly due to the systemic factors and some of the things going on around young people, which kind of talks to what Rachel was saying earlier about it. It's not something that just resides within an individual, it's something that's very much influenced by the other things going on around a young person. Okay, I think we're on breakout rooms next. Oh, it says summary. Unless you want to do summary now, Rachel, before we do breakout rooms. Maybe we do for the recording.
Yep, should we do that? So just thinking about kind of top tips, so quick summaries of things that you can do that are going to help in this situation. The kind of key things are: stop looking for a physical cause. That once it's been kind of accepted that a diagnosis of functional neurological disorder has been made, then stop looking for physical cause. Don't pay attention to symptoms, pay attention to things outside of your body. So if you kind of get a warning of an attack, sensory grounding can prevent it, which is a little technique that we kind of teach young people. You need to practice doing these things. You need to get other people around you to suggest doing it. So this is where we kind of really work with staff and schools to try and help young people start using some of these techniques that we talk about it. We encourage young people to carry something sensory so that they can really ground themselves, they can hold on to it and they can feel it, which may prevent an attack or stop an attack being as long as it might be. It's really important to make sure that we've got enough sleep, that we've had a good diet, that, you know, young people are feeling relaxed. Really got to try and get this whole over hardwired system back into a more relaxed state. Very important also to kind of understand the triggers so that we can not so much always avoid situations that might be kind of related to having kind of functional seizures, but so that we can manage and stagger how we try and get young people to re-engage with normal life. So we wouldn't, you know, if we know that a young person is having some sort of kind of functional presentation in maths classes, and it happens every time they go into a maths class, that may be one of the last things that we try and introduce when we're trying to get them back into normal life. But we do need to kind of have that message of things that it is safe to carry on. Normal activities will help, do fun stuff, but it does need to be gradual. And also this kind of important sense of that there has been some sort of kind of mismatch for young people between understanding that they may be feeling anxiety, they may be feeling depression, they may be feeling any other kind of psychological presentation, but it's being manifest in a physical way. And what we want to do is we want to try and help them to start understanding that how they're feeling is important, and that we need to kind of understand that and work with that so that they're not then kind of converting those feelings into a physical presentation. So talking about feelings and writing them down can help with that. Okay. Just a few bits of references here if people want to go on and get a little bit more information about that. There is a very interesting book to read, Sleeping Beauties, which kind of has some very interesting stories about functional presentations around the world. But also just if you're looking for some kind of just top tips, that website Neurosymptoms is really useful as well. Okay.
So thank you, Rachel and Virginia. Jamie, if we're going to stop